Hello, scholars. We're going to continue our discussion of key concepts for period 5 today. And we're going to talk about key concept 5.2, and that's imperialism and nation state forming. So as states industrialized during this period, they also expanded their transoceanic empires. Regional warfare as well as diplomacy resulted from this, and they were affected by this process of modern empire building. The process was mostly led by Europe, although not all states were affected equally. Sorry, that's a typo there. This led to an increase of European influence around the world. The United States and Japan also participated in the process, kind of getting in late in the game. The growth of these empires challenged the power of existing land-based or gunpowder empires that we've discussed throughout Eurasia. So new ideas about nationalism, race, gender, class, and culture also develop that facilitate the spread of transoceanic empires, as well as used to justify anti-imperial resistance and the formation of new national identities. So the newly industrial powers begin to establish transoceanic empires during this period. States with existing colonies strengthen their control over those colonies. Good examples are the British in India and the Dutch in Indonesia. So they're going to continue to strengthen these economies using the new industrial resources at their disposal. European states, as well as the Americans and the Japanese, established empires throughout Asia and the Pacific, while the old Spanish and Portuguese empires in the Pacific decline in power and authority. Many European states used warfare and diplomacy to establish empires in Africa, kind of shifting their methods to go along with the needs, or to go along with what best suited the particular region. In some parts of their empires, Europeans established settler colonies. This is specifically true in Australia and New Zealand for Great Britain, and in Algeria for the French. So the settler colonies are different because they have large numbers of Europeans moving to those regions. In other parts of the world, industrialized states practice less direct means of imperialism, economic imperialism. You had the British and the French expanding influence in China through the Opium Wars. The British and the U.S. used their economic power to expand influence and authority in Latin America. So obviously, the Opium Wars resulted in a weakened Qing dynasty, and of course, you have Teddy Roosevelt and his famous big stick diplomacy and the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which established American dominance in Latin America. So imperialism influenced state formation and a contraction of some states around the world. So you had the expansion of European and American influence over the Tokugawa in Japan, which led to a reaction against the Tokugawa and the emergence of Meiji Japan. The United States and Russia emulated European transoceanic imperialism by expanding their own land borders and conquering neighboring territories. So you see this by American expansion west into formerly Indian-controlled territories and/or Spanish and Mexican-controlled territories, and you see this by Russia expanding into east into Siberia. And people didn't just lay down; they resisted in various forms, sometimes directly and violently, sometimes they resisted more indirectly, but there was a fair amount of warfare. So this was not generally peaceful, even though many countries use economic power to do so. There was often very strident resistance to that imperialism. So one of the problems that face Europeans and Americans as they expand these empires is how to justify it. So what happens is all sorts of new racial ideologies develop, and one of the main, most of these fall under the idea of social Darwinism. This idea that first of all, that racial groups could be classified scientifically, and that certain racial groups were more prone to, or were more fit to compete and dominate in the world, and therefore that's why they did. Whereas some races were more fit for labor or things of that nature. So you have all of these kind of pseudosciences developing during this time period to try to justify imperial expansion and imperial rule. So we're going to roll right into concept 5.3, which fits nicely. We're going to talk about nationalism, revolution, and reform. So reactions to this expansion. So the 18th century marked the beginning of an intense period of revolution and rebellion against existing governments and the establishment of new nation states around the world. So Enlightenment thought and the resistance of colonized peoples to imperial centers is going to shape this revolutionary activity. And these rebellions sometimes result in the formation of new nation states altogether, and they stimulate the development of new ideologies. So these new ideas in turn further stimulated the revolutionary and anti-imperial tendencies of the period. So you have kind of this feedback loop. Enlightenment ideas lead to revolution, which lead to new ideas, which lead to more revolution. So a good example of Enlightenment philosophy and its influence is the rise and diffusion of Enlightenment thought that led to the questioning of established traditions in all areas of life. And they precede many of the revolutions and rebellions against the governments. So Enlightenment philosophers attempted to apply new ways of understanding to the natural world to human relationships and society. So the encouragement of observation and inference in all spheres of life. They also critiqued the role of religion because they insisted that reason was the most important thing, not faith. Other Enlightenment philosophers developed new political ideas about individuals, natural rights, and the social construct. So I'm going to run through a few of the major ones. Voltaire was a French philosopher who was a French philosophe who was focused on individual liberty. Specifically, he spoke out in favor of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So Rousseau is another French philosophe, and he talks about basically he believes that man is naturally born good, but that society corrupts people. So he famously wrote that man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. And he had this idea, this really interesting idea called the general will. And it was this idea that the government that worked best was that which best served the needs of most. Now he wasn't necessarily talking about democracy necessarily, but he believed that rulers should try to serve the general will. Then you have John Locke, who may be the most influential, or one of the two most influential on American government, and that he came up with the idea of natural rights. He said that all people were born with three natural rights: life, liberty, and life, liberty, and property. Jefferson later paraphrased that into life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, of course, in the Declaration of Independence. Lastly, I should say this. Locke also believed that man had those natural born rights, and if government did not protect those rights, then it was the right and even the duty of mankind to overthrow that government. A very important idea, this ideology of consent to the governed is extremely important. And the fourth one we're going to talk about is Baron de Montesquieu, another French philosophe who believed in the separation of powers. So he believed that in order to limit the power of government, you had to separate its powers into what we would know today as branches of government. So talking about the judicial, the executive, and the legislative, which we have discussed. You have discussed in your freshman government classes and probably throughout your life in school. But Montesquieu's ideas of separation of power really become the backbone of the U.S. Constitution and other documents, governing documents that follow. And as I mentioned, ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers are reflected in revolutionary documents and, of course, influence resistance to the existing political authority, whether it's the Declaration of Independence against the governing power, the government of England and its rule in the colonies, the Declarations on the Rights of Man and of the Citizen against the French monarchy, or Simon Bolivar's Jamaica letter arguing against the rule of European powers in Latin America. Those are all three heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideology. And these ideas also influence many people to challenge other existing notions of social relations, which result in the expansion of rights. You have the expanded suffrage later to women, but in Britain you had expanded suffrage to eventually you're going to have universal male suffrage, and of course this is going to be the basis of the women's suffrage movement. Obviously, abolition of slavery draws heavily on Enlightenment thought and ideas, this idea of all men being created equal. And the end of serfdom by Alexander II in Russia. Again, heavily influenced by Enlightenment. In reaction to Napoleonic expansion of the French in the early 19th century, you have the growth of European nationalism during this period. So German nationalism and Italian nationalism results in the unification of those countries into what we know as Germany and Italy today. You also have nationalism rise in the Philippines against first the Spanish rule, the rule of Spain, and then later on, as we'll talk about in the next unit, it'll be turned on the United States, who then colonizes the Philippines after defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War. And of course, Argentinian nationalism through the revolution, the revolutions against Spanish rule in Latin America as well. And you're also going to see increasing discontent with imperial rule that propels more reformist and revolutionary movements. You have the Marathas, or the Hindu warrior class, that revolt against the Mughals. The Mughals' inability really to control these rebellions, weaken it, and allow the British really to come in and take advantage. And of course, you have the Taiping Rebellion against the Qing dynasty. It ultimately was put down by conservative landowners, but really showed the weakness of the Qing to those conservative landowners, who then opposed attempts at reform to try to protect them from European imperialism. In the Americas, obviously, you have the revolutions that lead to independent states in the United States, Haiti, mainland Latin America, and of course, the French Revolution later on or the French Revolution as well, which was a revolt against the monarchy. And of course, you have slavery resistance to existing authorities in the Americas. You had the creation of maroon societies of escaped slaves in the Caribbean and Brazil that thrived and existed pretty much untouched by slave owners. North American slave revolts obviously were common, the most famous of which was Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia. So, slave resistance continues, sometimes violently, sometimes indirectly, but continue nonetheless. And you have the dual specters of questions about political authority, along with anti-colonial nationalist movements, such as the Indian Revolt of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Revolution, and the Boxer Rebellion in China. The Righteous Order of the Harmonious Fists, which lead to Boxer Rebellion and ultimately lead to the destabilization of the Qing dynasty. Some of these rebellions were influenced by diverse religious ideas. We've talked about the ghost dance in class and the Cosa cattle killing, both led by religious leaders who claimed a millennialist view of how to get rid of the imperialist powers. And you also had reactions in new ideologies and solidarities. Discontent with monarchist and imperial rule encourages development of political ideologies such as socialism and related thought processes. And finally had the rise of the rise of the globalist feminist movement. Mary Wollstonecraft, Olympia de Gouges, and Seneca Falls